Good morning, everybody. I was asked to quieten the room, and amazingly, all I needed to say was good morning, everybody, and it was immediate. So thank you very, very much. So a warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to day 2 of the Fragility Forum here at the World Bank Group headquarters in Washington, D.C. My name is Anastasia Gekas, and I head up IFC's Global Fragile and Conflict-Affected Situations Unit. Yesterday, what resonated so much for me and for the many people that I spoke to was the genuine recognition of the importance of job creation in breaking the devastating cycle of fragility. As one speaker put it, moving countries from fragility through stability and ultimately onto prosperity. The key role of the private sector in creating jobs has been emphasized throughout, and there's no one better to build on this today than our opening speaker, Makhtar Diop, the Managing Director of IFC. Makhtar's career spans both the public and private sectors. An economist by training, he started in the banking industry before joining the IMF. He also served as Minister of Economy and Finance of Senegal, his home country. Makhtar joined the World Bank Group in 2001, where he held various positions, including Vice President of Infrastructure and Vice President of Africa before taking on his current role. A recognized thought leader in the economics and social development fields, Makhtar has been named one of the 100 most influential Africans in the world. Please join me in welcoming Makhtar to the stage for his opening remarks, Investing for Jobs in Fragile Settings. Makhtar.
Good morning, everybody, and let me just say that I would like to thank everybody for these very kind words of introduction. And I cannot break a tradition, which is never to read what is have been prepared for me. So I will be living to my reputation of not of improvising a little bit my comments. And I think that and it's a joke, running jokes in my team. So. But I want to say that for me, this forum is very, very important. And I would like to thank all the colleagues and who are on screen. I said the head of UNDP, my colleagues in the field, and all those I've been working with in various occasions. When we talk about fragility, it's quite interesting in 2026. The way we talk about fragility 2026 is very different from the way we are talking about it 2012. Or in 2002, when I was in Kenya, launching the engagement, the first engagement of the World Bank Group for Somalia. At that time, people can only travel as close as kilometer 50 to Mogadishu, and it was not allowed to go there. So it was a totally different world, and you have a lot of refugees coming from Somalia and was living in part of Kenya. And this conversation was totally different because there were a lot of optimism of what we can do together by just bringing growth in a country to be and have the right protection program, social protection program, to bring inclusion and to fight fragility. Fast forward, I think we have a lot of things. First is geography matters, special development matters, and when you look at all countries who have been in conflict, there is somewhere somehow a geographical divide. Part of the country has been developed much faster than the other one, and that tension has created frustration in the population, has created the condition for people with ideologies which are not the ones that we accept to go and mobilize the youth and creating instability. So first lessons, we need to think about spatial development. If you don't bring rural roads in the north of a country where you don't have a condition to growth, if you don't have water there, if you don't have the minimum of public services in those areas, we will create the condition for instability and for fragility. So I think that when we talk about World Bank Group now, we are not talking only about this as IFC, MIGA, and IBRD, but we start to think about what is the package of intervention that will allow us to look at this special development in countries and places of the country which has been, for historical reason, abandoned. It means that we need to bring together not only electricity, but you need to be electricity, education, water, road, connection to markets. And I think that if you look at the logic between all these interventions that the World Bank Group has been launching recently, being AgriConnect, being M300, or water and health, the aims are doing that and bringing it in a much more coherent way. But I think one of the novelty is to bring it now as a bundle which is geographically concentrated in area where you have risk of fragility. So that's number one. Second question is that, and I will really steal a sentence from my friend Birama, and we talk about it later, which is what he calls the nano enterprises. You have the micro, small, etc. But it's true that in a lot of countries, in spite of the fragility, you always have someone from the private sector. It's not the private sector which is in Wall Street. It's not the private sector which is in the city in London. This is not the private sector which is in Nairobi. This is a private sector which is in the rural area. People who have shops, people who are delivering service, people who are selling Coca-Cola, people who are doing all these kind of things, but also we have another function in terms of economic development in the country. Because those people are also those that you can use to sell fertilizers to the farmer, that those that you can use to help selling seeds to the farmer in area which are disenfranchised. So looking at this category of small enterprises, nano enterprises, if you want to call it that way, or other enterprises, that ecosystem is critical to be able to fight fragility. And that's what we are trying to do now more and more with the MSME strategy that IFC 2030 is developing. It means what? It means that when we look at these categories of companies, we cannot use the same standard as the ones that you are using when you are looking at larger company. We cannot ask them the same rate of return. They don't have collaterals. They don't have access to market. They don't have capacity. And they don't have the means to pay for all these services that are needed to increase their productivity. So institutions like ours, the World Bank Group and IFC, working with the private sector, our role is to be there, to be able to help them so that we create the condition of growth. But when things are happening, and happen unfortunately, and these haven't been done before to create the condition to avoid conflict and avoid instability, and you have conflict and instability of internally displaced people, we need to think what we can do about it. And I think that we have been working very closely with the UNHCR to see how we can bring economic activity and make sure that the internally displaced people are also not a burden to the community, but a source of economic development. And I think that I will not fail to really thank, in Africa particularly, the role that leaders are playing in hosting community. This is a continent where the leaderships have been the most welcoming of people coming from other countries, of accommodating internally displaced people, and we need to continue supporting them in doing that. The fourth element that I would like to put in the conversation is that if we think about the whole ecosystem, there is something that in fragility is important that we need to address, which is identity. A lot of people moving from one place to another don't have an identity, a card or something like that. It's something, but when I was in infrastructure, with the ID4D initiative, we worked a lot to ensure that people who are displaced, people who are in fragile area can access public services. And one of the foundation was to know who they are. And you'll be surprised to see the number of people who don't have an ID, never been identified, and will never benefit from services, and therefore be excluded from the society and be easily captured by people who want to destabilize for different reasons of society. So this is a little bit the kind of thinking and the way we will be IFC looking at it. We will be putting a much larger amount of money of our own resources to support companies, those nanos, those micros, those small, particularly in those space. We will work with our colleagues of the World Bank Group to make sure that we have a spatial approach and we don't have a vertical approach sector by sector. We will be working around institutions because institutions matter. And I think that here, the big lessons of development in the last 20 years is that we need to close the gap between de jure and de facto. In a lot of these countries which are facing instability and fragility, on paper, the rules and the institutions are designed in a perfect way. But in reality, you see that it's nothing to do between what is on paper and the reality. So closing the gap between the de jure and de facto would be an essential part to address this fragility. And here, I bring a call to the civil society. The civil society, for me, is a big partner in monitoring the gap between the de jure and de facto in institution evolution in our country. The more the CSO working with us will help us identify the gaps, the more we will be able to address them and work with them. So this is a new paradigm. Another paradigm that I think that we could build together is to see the relation between those different groups in a much more harmonious, complementary approach towards a goal which is our common goal, which is create wealth and ensure that create jobs is the best way and sustain them to be able to address those challenges. So I will not make you a big speech about what IFC has been doing and will be doing, as good we are or not. I think that I want us to focus on what is next. And for me, the number one challenge is to create wealth in this area, build institutions, things in an integrated way in terms of geographic spatial development to close the gap between de jure and de facto in terms of effectiveness of institution. If we are managed to make progress on this in a consistent way, I think that we will be contributing in addressing some of the challenges on FCV. Shubham, who is leading the FCV's work with Anastasia, has put all these in a very articulated way in the strategy that I think that you have seen, but I would just wanted to give you a flavor of the kind of things that we're looking at in IFC. And I can guarantee you and confirm to you that we'll be putting more of our balance sheet, taking less guarantees, exposing our balance sheet and taking the risk on us to be able to support people who are in fragile situations. Thank you very much.
Is this working? Yep, everyone can hear me? Yep. Good. Well, look, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon to those joining online, and welcome to this plenary session at the Fragility Forum. My name is Val Ganendran, and I'm the UK's Executive Director here at the World Bank, and I'm going to be moderating this session. And we're talking about a big subject today. Maktar, you talked about how the world has changed since you first started working on this topic. And the subject today is how the international order is changing and what that means for how organizations like the World Bank should be working in FCV countries. And we've got a great panel who I'll introduce shortly. But before I do that, I just wanted to frame the discussion a little bit. So I think I've lost count of the number of times I've heard people talk about how the international order is changing. And quite often people add irreversibly to that. And when you get into these conversations, you realize lots of people talk about the international order in different ways. Of course, there's geopolitics, there's geoeconomics, economic security, changing trade relationships, and how all of that affects international cooperation. Of course, we've had the declines in traditional aid and the growth of the private sector that Maktar just talked about. There's conflict, migration, artificial intelligence, climate change. So when people talk about the international order, there's this huge range of issues that people are, I think, referring to. But what they all have in common is they're changing the context within which countries pursue their development, and they're changing the context in which the World Bank needs to operate. So this morning, we're going to try and unpack two questions. Firstly, what are the changes that we need to care about the most when we think about working in FCV settings? And then secondly, perhaps more importantly, what do those changes mean for how we need to work differently going forward? As I said, we've got a great panel, so let me introduce them. First of all, we have His Excellency Dr. Mohamed Jallo, who is the Vice President of Sierra Leone. He's joining us remotely from Freetown, as you can see. Sierra Leone is not an FCV country, but Sierra Leone has been incredibly proactive in addressing challenges and risks. We also have Minister Said, the Minister of Social Affairs from Lebanon, here in person. We have Mr. Birama Sidibe, who is the CEO, let me get this right, of Agrobiotech, which is a biotech company focused on resistant plant cloning based in Mali. We have Alexander De Croo, the UNDP administrator, joining us remotely, Melinda Bohannon, the Director General for Global Issues at the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and we have Ndiame Diop, who is the Vice President for Eastern and Southern Africa at the World Bank Group, joining us remotely from Nairobi. So that's our panel, and let's get started. So I'd like to spend the first part of the discussion focusing on what are the changes we most need to care about. And if I could ask each of you to try and limit yourselves to 4 minutes, so we have time for the second part of the discussion. So Your Excellency, Mr. Vice President, I wonder if I could start with you. I was part of a group of executive directors that was able to visit Sierra Leone a few months ago, and we heard about how Sierra Leone has had to deal with one crisis after another. So I wonder if you could tell us which are the changes in the world around us that have most impacted Sierra Leone, and is there anything we're not thinking about? I think you're muted in, we can't hear you. Oh, well, why don't we start with you, Minister Said, and then hopefully we'll get Freetown back in a second. Oh, sorry. Same question to you. I mean, Lebanon also has been through a huge number of crises and shocks. So when you think about the future of your country, what are the changes in the international system that you are most worried about?
Well, they are not hearing us.
Oh, we can, sorry, Minister, if you don't mind. Let's go back to Freetown. I think we can hear you, Mr.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. First, I want to start off with the opening remarks of our brother, Mr. Diop, Maktar Diop, about his definition that when you talk about fragility today is not what it used to be a couple of years ago. I just want to say today, when you define fragility, you have to define it in an unpredictable environment. You know, in an unpredictable environment today, if you look at the period, we have many assumptions that seems to underpin development policy planning. It does no longer hold. If you talk about we couple of years ago, we were talking about globalization. We are talking about how growing economies are going to be relatively integrated into market. We are talking about increased international development aid. We are talking about integrating African economies into global economies. But that landscape is changing and has changed dramatically. Today, if you look, the IDA, International Development Assistance, is slowing down just in 2025. You know, I happen to be in Sevilla, where in Spain, where we discuss about the prospect of financing development in developing countries. And the message was clear that the international window for development is closing down. And then we are faced with serious debt burden. We are servicing debt. And then today, interest is around geopolitical interests. Investment flows goes where there are geopolitical interests. So we are left with very, very limited choice, in the sense that if you add climate risks to that, and you also add vulnerabilities. So today, what you experience as a small economies like Sierra Leone, and also like other most sub-Saharan African country, is what you can call an overwhelming politics of very painful choices and then overlapping vulnerabilities. If you see today, if you think about COVID-19, just take COVID-19, and then by the time we are preparing to develop what we call a post-COVID-19 reaction plan, and then we were confronted with the Ukrainian crisis, and then now the Middle East. This has contributed immensely to increasing the prices of commodities, fuel prices, transport freight. So today, most countries like ours are in what are usually called, the politics of redistribution, meaning that whatever we generate today in the context of limited revenue is what we redistribute as subsidies to subsidize electricity, to subsidize fuel, and to subsidize transport, both locally to take market. And at the same time, all of this is happening where you have very limited domestic resources. Citizens' expectations are growing. Now, population is growing. Today, if you take a country like Sierra Leone, when I became vice president in 2018, there were about 240,000 kids that were born annually in this country. But today it's about 355,000 per year. Every day in a country like Sierra Leone, you have about 720 kids that are born in this country. And that equals to like 15 classrooms. So if you have a country where economy is growing down, international development assistance is slowing, and those ideological thinking that used to underpin the development landscape in terms of globalization, in terms of integration, in terms of supporting us with increased international development are going, then we are left now with some very painful choices. So I tell people today, we are now in a politics of painful choices. You have to make choice. We have to make a very strong choice between whether you want to pay teachers, or you want to build a road, or you want to build a hospital, or you want to pay nurses, or at the same time, do you want to invest in climate action, or you continue to service debt? So this is a very difficult period, and I think things have changed a lot. I think what we are not paying attention to, I must say, if I have to go back to the questions directly, is we are not paying attention to how unpredictability affects small economies like Sierra Leone. If I give you an example, a couple of last year alone, we were confronted with the closure of USAID. USAID closed their funding, and USAID we are contributing to the health as well as educational portfolio. So we had to call an emergency meeting to readjust. So unpredictability in itself is a vehicle. It's a vehicle to drive fragility. So when you add all the unpredictability around what is happening in terms of global, in terms of subsidizing essential commodities in a country like Sierra Leone, you had unpredictability in terms of drastic cuts with international development assistance. You talk about unpredictability in how development partners cut support for particularly very solid social investment. Then that is one key area I think we have not been paying attention to. The other thing is what Mukhtar Diop was just talking about, is we have not been paying attention to what drives fragility around the world. How do we support programs that create jobs, sustainable jobs? If you take a country like Sierra Leone today, over 65% of the population are below 35 years old. And when you categorize all the big development assistance, the compact that we have, you take the energy compact, you take the health compact, you take the water forward compact, and then you take the Mission 300 compact. What is missing in all of this is that a compact on job creation, a compact around how do we ensure that we create jobs for young people. I think in Sierra Leone today, the question we have to ask ourselves is not much how to continue to support new investment. Is how do we sustain the gains we have already made, particularly in the context of growing fragility. Like I've just emphasized, where you have a situation where the demand is high and you don't have enough revenue, population growth is high, and then dwindling international development. Leaders like us in small economies like Sierra Leone, we are left with no choice but to make very painful choices. And some of these painful choices, they relate to the unpredictability of the international global order. the unpredictability in terms of overseas development assistance, and also the nature of investment. I'm very happy that Maktar Diop made mention about job creation and made special reference to special development. How do we sustain the gains that we have already, made? And then moving forward, how do we begin to carve out new areas, new packages of investment that can drive sustainability in terms of job creation, in terms of resilience? More importantly, like I said today, the biggest challenge we are facing from this part of the world is how do you make painful choices in the context of fragility? I think from this side, that is what I will say as my opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I think this message of how it's becoming, you just have to run even faster just to stand still in a world of constant unpredictability is one we'll keep returning to. Minister Said, can I ask the same question of you now? And thank you. I think Lebanon as well is a country that's faced many, many shocks and crises. And so when you think about the international order, what are the things that you think we need to most focus on in terms of the changes?
When I think of the international order, I get scared, honestly. But let me unpack that. First, to say thank you very much for inviting Lebanon to be part of this forum, which is very timely for us. As you all know, we are now going through a second war in less than 3 years, and this has had an enormous impact on people. We have 1 million displaced, 20% of the population, which has been on the move within the first 48 hours after March 2nd. And challenges are enormous. And this comes at a time when we'd already not gotten over the impact of the war that ended in 2024, neither out of the economic financial crisis that hit us started in 2019, of course, even COVID, and then we had the Port of Beirut blast. So we've had these poly crises that have come one after the other. And Lebanon, for sure, is not an observer. Lebanon is of the changing world order. We are directly impacted, most of which has, of course, been negative, and on top of the internal issues that we have. So the geopolitics, of course, is the most challenging, the shifts in geopolitics. Now, on some level, the shift or the changes that happened in our neighbor Syria 2 years ago has been, by and large, considered a positive change, because and has huge potential in terms of opening up trade routes and business and investment, Lebanese investing in Syria and the like. So all that is huge potential. At the same time, neighboring country Syria is still not totally stable to the level where either Lebanon or Syria can really benefit. And of course, we have our southern neighbor who's been relentless in terms of the bombardments on Lebanon. As you know, we have more than 3,500 casualties so far. We have more than 1 million that have been displaced. We have more than 60,000 housing units totally destroyed. This is on top of what was destroyed in the previous war of about 200,000 housing units, and so on and so on. I can give the numbers, but so hugely impacted, fragility at its maximum, and we're at a time when the global environment, the financial aid architecture has shifted dramatically. I always like to quote Tom Fletcher, who says a few years ago, 2-3 years ago, there was $50 billion in humanitarian aid. Today, he's barely able to get $20 to $23 billion into the system, and it's still not all secured. In our own region, typically the countries that come to Lebanon's financial aid are the GCC countries, which, however, now themselves are impacted enormously and very busy with their own situation. So we caught at a moment, I say this war could never have come at a worse time. Of course, no wars come at good times, but this one in particular. In the only in 2024, we were able to get $700 million coming as humanitarian aid to Lebanon from that war. Today, we are at barely 300 million, and we've way surpassed the number of days. The previous war was 66 days. Today, we are in the 100th day of this war, and we don't know where it's going to end. So financial aid is very, very challenging, and this is having a big impact. Of the 1 million displaced, I would say we're able to provide maybe 30 or 35% of the needs at this point. And now there are some of the displaced are fending for themselves, dipping into their savings, but we know that the savings are going to run out very quickly because most of them have lost their jobs. So it's adding crises over crises. We're very worried about, of course, the long-term impact on human capital, on people's ability to adapt. I mean, this so-called notion of resilience, which is very fundamental, and I believe we in Lebanon we do have that. However, it is stretched at all levels. In my own ministry, where we had to shift on March 2nd when the war erupted from development. We've had all these development plans, which we had launched and started, early childhood development, really investing in early childhood, people with disabilities, getting them into the job market, all these great plans. And then all of a sudden, come March 2nd, and we have to turn into being a humanitarian ministry, delivering food and aid and the like. So big challenges. Now, what I've realized, however, is that it's very important to keep the focus on both the humanitarian and the development track, because what we've learned repeatedly is that these bouts of crisis or fragility are so frequent that, in fact, they're more of the norm than the sort of more stable development mode. So we have to be constantly working on both tracks. Mukhtar mentioned the IFC, and he just left, but I wanted to say that absolutely investing in jobs is the key thing we need, which we had started to do before. But the issue is moving things to scale. And that's where I think there's lacking. I can speak about this a bit further later regarding also how the IFIs can maybe step up more. But just to sort of conclude on this, geopolitics is a huge impact on us. The change in the financial aid architecture is also very straining on us being able to move forward. But we have plans, we have a commitment, and I think our work with the international community is really what, at this point, we're trying to solidify to be able to get out at least of this particular crisis before the next one comes.
Thank you, Minister. I think I want to come back to this question of resilience, how we invest in it, but also the limits of resilience that you talked about. But Alexander de Cruz, I wonder if I could come to you. The Minister just talked about geopolitics, the changing international aid architecture. I mean, as a representative of the UN and as leading one of the major UN organizations, you're at the heart of many of these changes. So I wonder if you could give your perspective on the major changes in the international system that you think are most important to this discussion. And we hear a lot about the UN 80 process. Will that help? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, and good morning to everyone. I think first of all, it is clear that in the world of today, fragility can be at your front door for everyone. Even if you think that you are a very stable country with good financial resources, with strong institutions, fragility can be there anytime, and we've seen. For example, now with what is happening in the Gulf region, that the impact of a few weeks of war can wipe out years of development progress throughout the world, and the impact goes way beyond of the Gulf region itself. Now, what does that mean in the way we need to operate? I think first of all, it means that in anything we do as development actors. And to me, development actors is broad. That is, yes, development organizations, but also financing actors, also our local partners, civil society, is that you need to incorporate fragility, resilience, recovery from the start at everything which we do. It means that you need to work in an integrated way, but especially incorporate that element in any intervention that you do, and really look at it from a system perspective. In the way we approach this, and we have developed an approach which is called moving beyond crisis. We look at it in three different stages. A first one is the preventive side, where we have to act as early as possible. As I said, in everything we do, building institutions that are resilient, helping to create economic development that is as inclusive as possible. And in any type of building of society that we do, take into account that, as I said at the start, crisis might be at your front door, even at the most unexpected moment. So that is the first element, is acting early. Second, if that crisis happens, is acting as fast as possible, but keeping a development perspective. And I really appreciate what the Lebanese Minister of Social Affairs just said. 2 weeks ago here in New York, had an interaction with the Lebanese Justice Minister, Minister Nasser, who clearly said, despite all the difficulty that we are encountering, we want you to continue doing the reforms of the justice system. So don't lose your compass on development outcomes, even when you are in a crisis. Continuing to have that perspective of longer term development is one that you need to keep, and the recovery effort basically starts on day one. It used to be seen as a sequential thing. First you do food, and then you do shelter, and then you do basic services. That's not the way we look at it now. The way we look at it now is that you keep doing the development work, even knowing that there might be very urgent needs which are on the response side. Third element is connecting and connecting much earlier. The Lebanese minister talked about the difficulties that Tom Fletcher and OCHA is encountering. We know that with all the financial cuts that there have been, the hyper prioritization of humanitarian organization leads that there might be a gap on the recovery and the rebuilding side, and we know that as development organizations we have to be involved, and we are being asked to be involved much earlier than before, and that is a good thing from our perspective. So, in summary, to do that, I would say have a fragility, which means resilience, recovery, and rebuilding perspective in any intervention that you do, because crisis may be there at the most unexpected ways, and working in a much more integrated way. Maybe touching on UNAIDS, because you asked that question at the end. Well, look, it links to a few of the things that I said. We've seen that the funding has been reduced, or the public funding has been reduced, but there's no lack of capital in this world, and working together with partners in doing the reforms that can unleash other types of capital, even in very difficult circumstances of fragility, is one of the elements that UNAIDS is trying to achieve. That is also linked to peace and security. We know that the cuts on the peace and security side are gigantic. We've seen a reduction of 60% of deployed troops if you compare today with 2015, which means that there are greater expectations on the classic development perspective of also being a part of the stabilization and the security agenda. We often say that development is part of the security agenda, and development is probably the ultimate preemptive strike that you could have. In a security perspective, a preemptive strike is something that you do to avoid that a crisis develops. I think that we, as development operators, together with IFIs and others, we can be that preemptive strike. It's not always 100% successful, but that preemptive strike is one way of avoiding that a crisis would develop or that a crisis would have a too broad lasting impact.
Great, thank you, Alexander. Let me pick up on a few of those points. Melinda, maybe I'll come to you next. I mean, we've heard from all of our speakers, I think, so far about in a world of repeated crises, you can't just focus on the short term, you also have to keep an eye to the long term. That's obviously harder in a world of reduced ODA flows, reduced aid, which everyone has so far spoken about. So as a bilateral donor, can you say a bit about how donor priorities are changing? What does the future of aid look like for you?
Brilliant. Thank you, Val, and thank you for inviting the UK to speak on the panel. So just to take a step back first to answer the first question, which is what are the big shifts that we need to think about as we're thinking about development strategies? I mean, I would sort of name three stylized broadly. The first, I think for sure, is the fact that we are probably leaving an era of conscious globalization into an era of geoeconomics and economic security and supply chain management. And I think the big shift there, and it was articulated really well by His Excellency from Sierra Leone, is that whereas previously we'd relied on this notion that globalization would continually lift poor countries through integrating into the global economy, probably that assumption now we need to challenge more, because whether it's through great power rivalry, whether it's through a focus on critical minerals, there's more and more focus on friendshoring, thinking about national economic interest as sort of somewhat separate from a globalized economy, and thinking first and foremost about sort of the sort of national citizen social welfare. So leaving an era of globalization, although I say that sort of in a highly stylized way, because obviously we can't entirely, but that's a key trend. The second one, I think, which no one's mentioned, but I do think is material for development, is the changing nature of technology, the rise of AI, emerging technology frontiers, and the race for innovation and adoption, particularly between the two great powers, the US and China. And the reason I mention that is because power will be held by those who are the front runners in both the development of that technology, but also the adoption of that technology in terms of how their economies adapt. And then the third big trend that is sort of continuing and accelerating, I think, is that which is around climate and environmental security. So the overlay of the climate crisis onto humanitarian, onto conflict, bound into that questions about how we are valuing or destroying and not valuing enough our environmental assets, matters hugely, particularly for economies who need to think very hard about what is the assets they're trying to build, how do they protect them, how do they trade in them. So I would take that first step back and think about those big shifts. So what does that then mean for what development actors do? And I think the first and obvious thing to say is there's a lot less money to go around in this system, but the needs are rising. And one of the reasons there's a lot less money to go around is the decline in ODA, which is well documented. I think that is part and parcel of the shift toward national interest first. I mean, certainly we've experienced that in our own country, in the UK. So there's a lot less money to go around, a lot less grant finance to go around. And the very first question becomes, how do you make best possible use of that in a world of rising need and ongoing fragility? And there, I think we need to distinguish between use of grant ODA for countries where they really need it for humanitarian, for social protection, for poverty, where markets won't go. But then I think the flip side of that is thinking ever harder about how do you mobilize capital at scale for solutions where markets can be part of the answer. Now, what we often worry about, and I think get quite confused about, is this question of, well, surely the whole of development cannot become about private capital mobilization because it won't work everywhere and it won't work for poverty everywhere. And I think that is correct. But we need to really carefully, I think, distinguish between where we need grant ODA and where we can really go after this question of private capital mobilization. We know assets under management globally are the order of several trillion. It's concentrated too much in North America and in parts of Europe. So a big question becomes, how do you unlock that for the benefit of countries where there are strong investable propositions, where demography trends are accelerating, where we know the infrastructure needs are high, the energy transition needs are high. So that's one thing that we talk about when we think about the UK is the shift from donor to investor. What we mean by that is we need to get a lot better at thinking about how to harness the potential of private capital. And I think the second thing is what I describe as joining the dots, but perhaps we've talked more about in this conference setting as partnership. So we know, unfortunately, in international development, that we've seen a strong, real proliferation of donor organizations, international organizations, overlapping mandates, all competing for an ever-dwindling pot of resource. It doesn't help countries who are fragile, where the transaction costs to engaging with many different development actors are very high. What countries really need is a partnership with actors who are prepared to get behind their national plans. We talked about this yesterday in the context of social protection, and brave streamlining, which sees the different organizations saying, actually, do you know what, we're going to step back from this because we think the resource is best allocated through local organizations, or we don't want to be part of this competition at country level, which is distracting from the government. And that sort of issue of partnership, coordination, streamlining, and very deliberate focus on getting behind the countries in question, behind their plans and working through their systems, has to be part of the response to all of this. And then the last thing is this question of expertise. So I think one of the strongest offers that we have as the UK, I certainly think this is the case for many of the G7, is knowledge, expertise in the economic reforms that we've undertaken, for example, and how those can be applied. Research and evidence, some of the biggest offers that we can possibly make come through how we research in the future of agri-technology, clean tech, vaccine development. I mean, we see this playing out right now in the context of Ebola and certainly before through COVID, and how we can channel that and offer that as the window not only to UK grant money, but also the window to what the UK is able to offer much more broadly through the totality of our research, our higher education, our health knowledge, life sciences, and so forth. There's much more that we can offer that isn't just about grant aid. So the shift away from always thinking about grants into thinking about expertise exchange will be the last thing. So to summarize, more focus on investment, concentrating grant aid where it needs to be, much more working through government partners and local organizations, much more thinking about systems rather than trying to buy results, much more emphasis on expertise exchange and using the benefits of our own research, our own knowledge in the countries for the benefit of working with global South partners, much more emphasis on partnership.
Thank you, Melinda. You talked a bit there about private sector, and Mr. Sidibe, we've heard from all of our speakers actually from in different ways about the importance of the private sector for jobs as a source of finance. So as we rely more and more on organizations like yours as the future of development, when you think about the world as it is now, what are you worried about? What should we be worried about? Grateful for your views on that.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and thank you for having me here today. It is true, to borrow from Madam Ministers, that the international system is scary. It's true also that it's fragmented. It's true that the traditional aid is shrinking. But I want to be candid. View from the private sector perspective, this is not worrying me at all. Why? For me, I see this as historical alignment, long overdue historical alignment. For decades, Mr. Moderator, the conversation on development treated the private sector like a secondary actor or an afterthought. But the pressure now on the international system of financing architecture is forcing to rethink the way the development is delivered. it is recognized now and accepted by everybody that to close the financing gap of that shrinking aid, you need private capital to come in. So the private sector should be at the center of the conversation, the center of the coalition for the development. Then, if you compare the structural contribution of the private sector versus the public sector, you'll be surprised by the reality, which is almost a stark, and the role of what was seen as to be a secondary actor, in fact, is not the one for a secondary actor. If you look at the job creation, if you look at the SDGs, you see that government through ODA, the public sector through ODA and government, they see the initial infrastructure, but the trillion that are needed for the SDG really are coming from the private capital. It's for me, it's really surprising or interesting to note that the SDG, which was where we're coming from, didn't mention job. It mentioned education, it mentioned health, access to water, and so on, but didn't mention job, didn't mention private sector. So what is happening today is give the opportunity to put the private sector at the center of a conversation. If you look at the job creation, which is, again, another swing, which I hope is not a fashion, the job creation, which is seen to be a prerequisite for or leading to poverty alleviation, which was the key buzzword before. If you look at the contribution of both sectors, you will see that it has been said again and again, 90% of all jobs are created by the private sector. Innovation, you can name innovation. Government can regulate, government regulates, but the innovation in technology, in mode of operation is coming from the private sector. If you look at the tax and the sovereignty perspective, you see that for a country to be sovereign, it needs to have a solid tax base. And who is doing the wealth, who is creating the wealth for the taxation is the private sector. So for me, really, it's a new happening. It's a new happening, and I don't see what may appear as a threat, global threat, the shrinking of development aid. For me, it's not a threat, really. It's a kind of unleashing the private sector to play into the game. So that's what I see in terms of change, or to which extent it affects the private sector. It's a huge opportunity. The development conversation is around what matters today. So for me, the consequence for a group like the donors, the World Bank, the IFC, and MIGA, I see it as a seamless intervention. You cannot just say private sector and public sector. They have to be a seamless intervention with the guarantee. It's a new days. It's scary from the perspective of government. It's scary because everything seems scattered and everything is almost subject to nightmare. If you look at the television, the suffering of people. But it's a new day also for the way we look into the development, not the dichotomy of private versus public. It's a good opportunity because if you look back, you come to realize that the official development aid didn't flow toward the private sector, really. It flows for government to create public goods, health, education, and so on. But now, the private sector should come in and you also consider as something which is create job and which at the end of the day lead to poverty alleviation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sidibe. And actually, it's reinforced, I think, the central theme for those of you that had a chance to look at the summary of the new FCV strategy, jobs is very much central to that in a way it wasn't in the precursor one. And I think that reinforces what you said. And Jeremy, maybe you can help us wrap up this first opening part of the discussion. You cover a number of FCV countries in your role. What are the things that keep you up at night? And do you sort of echo some of the comments from our panelists so far?
Thank you very much, Val, and very nice to be here, including among some familiar faces. Shanine is somebody I've worked with a while ago, maybe 20 years ago in Lebanon and Jordan. So very nice to see you as well. So I'm actually connected from Mozambique, which is one of my 11 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa that are classified as fragile and conflict affected. That group includes also Ethiopia and DRC, two of the largest population in my region. So this group of countries basically have the highest rate of poverty. They represent more than 50% of the population in the region. And we dedicate about 40% of our active portfolio investment in this group of countries. Although what Alexander said earlier resonates very well with me. Sometimes I have the sentiment that all my countries are fragile, all the 26 countries. I strongly believe that it is absolutely critical to address the challenges in these countries if we are to reduce poverty, if we are to even achieve our World Bank Group targets and deliver our program. So this is really a very critical group of countries and issues to deal with. Now, what sort of keeps me up at night? What are the trends that really make me the most worried? I would say that maybe three. One of them is, I think it's been said by many, the lack of jobs and the youth bulge in these FCV countries. The average fertility rate in FCV countries in this region is 1/3 higher than in non-FCV countries, 4.4 versus 3.3 births per woman. And the gap between the number of people entering the labor force and the number of jobs created is the largest in this group. So this basically means that the lack of job, which, by the way, I think is not always, let me put it this way. In the countries that I observe, the number one driver of fragility is actually politics. It's the contested political settlement regarding the balance of power between different groups, different regions, between central and local, and lack of jobs, spatial inequality, lack of inclusive growth, all come together to amplify that. I think this is really important to keep in mind, because I think politics interacts with security and economics, and focusing only on the economics would not really solve the problem. It is absolutely critical, in my view, to support all those efforts in peace building, in conflict resolution, in political dialogue within countries, to make sure that we address this properly. Only in that condition, all the effort we're making to really help these countries create jobs will bear fruit. So this is really one of the key concerns. Lack of job, but interacting with a very complex political environment associated also with security concerns and so on. So that's the first one. The second one is really the fact that these conflicts, they spill across borders and they worsen other crises. For example, the civil war in Sudan has triggered one of the world's largest displacement crises, which has worsened an already difficult situation in neighboring countries, whether it's Ethiopia, Somalia, other countries. And then the same can be said about DRC. In Eastern and Southern African countries, we have about 25 million internally displaced population. That's more than the population of Zambia or Malawi. So this negative, in a way, externality for countries that are neighboring those countries that are fragile and in conflict, it has a very big cost. I think, as Mahtar was mentioning, many countries in the region have been really at the forefront of welcoming refugees and integrating them in their economy. But it's a very complex process as we observe it. Countries like Kenya, Uganda are doing really a very good job in accommodating refugees, but they're doing it in a context of low fiscal space and reduction in foreign aid, which makes this very difficult. And often these refugees are settled or hosted in communities that are the poorest in countries. So I think this is really something that deserves the attention of the international community because it really expands or increases the space, the geographical space affected by uncertainty, conflict, but also the negative perception of risk, which affect all countries. And we know that, I agree with what was said about private sector being the main driver of job creation, but it is very difficult to attract investment in an environment where this combination of factors really increases the risk for investment to a great deal. The last point I wanted to mention in terms of trend that is concerning is really climate change. I'm here in Mozambique, and yesterday with Pascal, we visited Vilanculos, which is a sort of paradise, maybe the next Bali of Africa. Very beautiful, but lacking everything in terms of infrastructure. But then one disheartening fact is that the combination, a series of cyclones and coastal erosion are affecting the sort of natural assets in a very concerning way. And just north of Vilanculos, in the Capo Delgado region, we have potentially, the sort of some of the most beautiful potential tourism destination, but there we have an active conflict, which is making it difficult for people to move in. So the interaction between the climate change and the conflict, and the interaction between refugees and security and conflict is really at play in this region. We can see it also in the Ebola, with the Ebola crisis in DRC. Some of the areas that are affected by this health crisis are areas of conflict. So to deploy the health workers and to deploy logistics and to really support the population in those areas, it's extremely complicated. So I think these are some of the key things that really keep me up at night. And I think the approach, how to respond to this, is just what we are trying to do, which is to stay engaged and to really act early when we see some signs of countries being affected by this. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Ndiame. Okay, let's wrap up this sort of first half of the conversation. I mean, Minister, you talked about the international order being scary, and I think we've sort of heard variations on that. No country is immune from fragility. And Ndiame, you talked about the fact that conflict in one country or fragility in one country often has regional spillovers. The impact of climate change is making things worse. We've heard a lot about jobs in the private sector, but at the same time, the Vice President, Melinda, you talked about the retreat from globalization and the rise of geoeconomics and economic security. I mean, that's a pretty tough picture. We knew that, I think, coming into this meeting. But let me sort of go to the next part of this conversation, which is, so what do we do about all of this? I mean, we've heard a little bit about that already. And Ndiame, I might come straight back to you because, of course, the FCV strategy is just one part of the bank's overall response. And I wonder if you can just paint the slightly broader canvas of what the bank is trying to do across the full suite of its operations in terms of addressing the challenges all countries face.
Sure. I think a couple of big changes that are ongoing at the bank. Number one is all of us, all the different parts of the bank are laser focused on jobs. Jobs is really the driver of what we do. And in fact, in the FCV countries, without addressing the job problem, it will be very difficult to really turn around these countries. So it has to be done alongside all the things that I mentioned, but it is very central. And we have a World Bank Group job strategy that is articulated around 3 pillars. One is foundational infrastructure. It's been mentioned. It's really critical to build the productive capacity of these countries. And that includes both the physical infrastructure, energy, transport, digital, but also the human capital part of it, education and health, which are really central. Second is the business enabling environment, without which it will be very difficult to attract private capital, without which it will be even difficult to get the result expected from those investments in Pillar 1 on infrastructure. So the job focus is really central. Second, we are focused on outcome and really shifting away from counting beans and counting the money allocated, but really making sure that we reach ambitious targets for our countries. We have World Bank Group targets that are set along in partnership with our development partners, and we hold ourselves accountable to achieving those big ambitions, working very closely with countries around some compacts in the key areas. The third one is really One World Bank Group. We are mobilizing all the instruments in the institution, right? Not one instrument is sufficient to address these issues. You need IBRD and IDA investment on key public goods. You need private sector investment to create all the jobs. And you need de-risking devices, guarantee platform from MIGA to crowd in more private and commercial capital to really reach those ambitious goals and targets that I mentioned. And then finally, let me mention that our big focus on leveraging and mobilizing capital, because as was said, even the World Bank financing, which is perhaps among the largest in all our countries, is very insufficient to address the huge development needs that we face. So partnership is important. Leveraging the capital and the strengths of other partners is absolutely critical. And leveraging crowding in private sector is very important. So we are using our IDA resources, for example, our concessional resources in a very strategic way. And we are also helping countries to use their budget in a strategic way to crowd in additional financing from the private sectors and other partners in order to meet the sort of ambitious target that they have and that we have.
Thanks, Ndiame. That's really helpful. Your Excellency, Mr. Vice President, I wonder if I could come to you. You mentioned earlier that, and this picks up a bit on Ndiame's comments about this focus on outcomes, that Sierra Leone, you're part of Mission 300, you have the Energy Compact, you're part of Water Forward, you have the Water Compact, you're part of Health Works, all of these World Bank flagship initiatives Sierra Leone has embraced. You mentioned the need for a jobs compact. I think that's a strong theme coming. But is this the right approach? Is this how we should be approaching, given everything we've heard about the international order, is this mission approach focusing on key things? Is that the right way, do you think?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I think Sierra Leone has embraced all those World Bank flagship initiatives. In fact, we have even built a compact around them. I will start with Mission 300. Mission 300, when we were doing the assessment, the assessment for the MCC, we realized that one of the key factor to unblock, economic constraints, to unblock economic potential in this country was energy. So the Mission 300 really, we developed a compact around it, and it's a $2.2 billion compact. and it's going to address critical, because right now we are at 36% energy access, and we intend that by 2030, we're going to move that to about 78, 80%. And then the second one is the health compact. You know, we have another health compact, which is a $1.3 billion health compact that was signed in Japan. And also, that is also going to help us sustain the gains we have made over the years in the health sector, because between 2018 and 2025, we have been able to reduce maternal mortality by nearly 79%. And then we want to recruit more additional health workers. We want to expand special baby care unit. And more importantly, we want to solarize about 1,800 health facilities in this country. We have started that. That is ongoing. And then you have the Water Forward Compact, which is a $1 billion compact. That's also an initiative, World Bank initiative. We'll be able to build a compact around that. That is going to help improve access to water, safe drinking water. Although we still note that the deficit in that space is very huge. You need billions of dollars for Sierra Leone to be able to provide safe drinking water for the population. But at least that compact is a very good starting point to understand that. We are also in the process of finalizing the AgriConnect, you know, for final submission to the World Bank. Yes, I agree. All these flagship programs are a very good starting point, a very viable response, because they provide an opportunity for international financing to be tied directly to what we call national priorities in the area of energy expansion, healthcare delivery, smart agriculture, and more importantly, access to safe drinking water. However, there are just two issues I want to underline in relationship to that. The first one is what I call the convergence shocks, meaning that you have all of these four fantastic programs. How do we connect them together? Because when you have, you know, it's the same thing when you have a farmer that is being affected by climate shocks, in the sense that the flooding is taking place in that area, and the same farmer is taken to the hospital for treatment. Does he have access to energy? So how do we connect that? That is another discussion we are having, and we are going to have that today with the World Bank MD that is sitting beside me here. We are, over the years, we want to see how the Office of the Vice President, you know, that has a convening power, will be able to create a unit that can coordinate, so that at the end of the day, we'll be able to create linkages, you know, between all of these interventions. The second point is the point I made earlier about these are fantastic initiatives, but they have to be driven by job creation. Because if you look at all these World Bank initiatives, you realize that at the center of all of these ones, you have sensitivity to climate action. If you look what we are doing in Mission 300, it's really most of renewable, our transition. It's a mixed grid, you know, of solar, hydropower. And if you go around the health, you realize that over 1,800 of our health facilities are going to be solarized. And then, of course, in terms of agriculture, we are focusing on smart agriculture of water access. So climate centrality is addressed in all of these flagship initiatives. Now, how do we integrate it in a way that at least it becomes an engine for creating jobs for young people? That is very, 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 very important. You know, this brings me back to listening to our previous other speakers before me on the fragility contrast. You know, I think I deduced two strands. You have externally induced fragility that comes out of unpredictability, like what our sister in Lebanon was explaining. You know, they never planned for an attack. They never planned for that kind. These are induced fragility from outside. They also have nationally induced fragility within our own place. That is around politics, around what we do, around environment crises. And I think now, what does this tell us? It tells us that we have to rethink, both domestically, international partners together, we have to rethink how do we support countries with extreme vulnerabilities, and what are the kind of instruments that we need to put at their disposal. So at this stage, I think those initiatives are fantastic initiatives, but we have to try and see how we can address the convergence element, and as well the job creation element, which is critical for transitioning out of fragility. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. This is, let me just pick up, I think this is a fantastic point that's come out, this distinction between external sources of fragility and domestic sources of fragility. And Minister Said, can I come back to you? Because you talked earlier about resilience, how important this is, and you didn't expect many of the shocks that have obviously come at Lebanon. But you did talk about resilience, how we need to do it. And we heard from Alexander about the need to invest early in some of these sort of resilience measures. When you think about the support you get from organizations like the World Bank, what more can they do to help countries like yours with resilience and dealing with both those types of sources of fragility?
Thank you. I think the most important advantage of the World Bank and a few other organizations, of course, not exclusively, is that they stay the course, is that the country feels that they're by our side long term. And I think that's important, especially when we go through this kind of crises. There's a partner to count on. And this, of course, applies to all other partners, not just the World Bank. However, what I think is lacking is speed. This is something that when I was at the World Bank was an issue, speed of responding and delivering, and now I see it on the other side that is still there. Because when we get into these kind of situations, this is what really matters, to quickly have the technical assistance, the expertise, which the bank and other organizations, UK, of course, as well, are very equipped with. But that has to be quick. We sort of this knowledge, this cross-country comparison that is at the bank's hand, but sometimes it takes a lot of processes to get it out there. Now, for a country like Lebanon, we're always faced with, okay, we have institutions like the World Bank, which are for middle-income countries like Lebanon, primarily loan-based support, which is, however, unfortunate because fragile country, we're not eligible for IDA type of assistance because we're still lower middle. At the same time, we are a highly indebted country, which many fragile countries are, and therefore our capacity to borrow has reached its limit. So we're stuck in this space in the middle. When I was working on the Syrian response crisis, the World Bank created something called the Global Concessional Facility, which was trying to solve that. But again, that's not enough. So for countries that are fragile, middle income, highly indebted, how can we really have serious resource transfer? I don't think that we have reached a solution to that. And as we said, we resort, of course, to humanitarian aid, but that has been declining. Now, private sector, absolutely. And I think the focus that the bank has now on even more and more private sector support and engagement, yes, again, but this is an economy that is now probably going to have 5 to 7% negative growth. Hard to get the private sector engaged, especially, let's say, the big investments. We are trying to do more active labor market programs or activation programs requiring subsidies, require support to the microfinance institutions. I think here the World Bank and IFC can much more help us than they are currently, because I do agree, this is really right now with the population of displaced, we've got to start not just rebuilding their human capital or preserving it, but also try to give them a livelihood, get them into some kind of job. And then similarly, for those that are not displaced, because we also have a part of the population who are not displaced, but are poor, and also those need support into jobs. So maybe in some multiple tools, we need more, faster, and scale. Because if we're not making an impact quickly to the people now, there will be much more dissatisfaction, and it'll be much harder to get that engine going again.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Minister. Let me follow up on this point about jobs, both for, I guess, people affected by fragility and the people not. And Mr. Sidibé, can I come back to you? We were talking earlier about MSMEs. Maktar mentioned them. This is a key part of the new World Bank FCV strategy. Do you think this is the answer, that we need to focus much more? I mean, it seems to be the big common theme of this discussion so far is all about jobs, but perhaps say a bit more about that and what we need to focus on.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the approach by the MSME sector is the right instinct. It's normal. But in the FCV context, this kind of structure, pyramidal structure of the MSME sector can collapse or usually collapse easily. Why? Because the large company tend to run away in FCV context. The medium and small scale back or reduce their operation to mitigate the risk. So who stays to create jobs? It's a micro and what I call the nano part. It's really proper to FCV. So nano and micro cluster of the sector really is the area to look into closely. Why? Because it's only those ones that still stay there, offer goods, render service that is needed in a civil context. I mean, the shopkeeper, the food keeper, the repairs, the mechanics, everybody needs that, like an ambulance service in wartime. Everybody needs it. All belligerent needs ambulance service. Those are what I call the nano. So the nano in FCV context, you should pay attention to them. You should develop not policy, but let's say quick wins in order to be able to let them continue to survive and be the engine of creation of jobs. So those quick addition or quick win we can imagine is a kind of regulatory protection under a kind of regulatory protection ring fencing, institutional ring fencing. That's very important to protect those vulnerable entrepreneurs, to have a well-tailored fiscal engagement with them, a one-stop shop for their operation. Once you have that quick win on institution, you can go on to think of kind of market infrastructure, because those micro and nano, they are very good at trade. So they need infrastructure. Normally, they are scattered all over the place. So market infrastructure by line of business is a very smart, quick win. It can be implemented. But it can be implemented through even local financing under the PPP arrangement. The last one, which I see it as a quick win, would be on the energy side. Now, I was telling you that that cluster is very resilient, it's adaptive. It's really survivalist kind of institution. But there is one thing that resilience cannot overcome is energy. So clustering them, hubbing them, having that would ease really the point of access of energy to them. That energy could be generated through solar. Again, we can find local investor that can, in a PPP arrangement, protect these guys. So those are the kind of thing I think very important. The cluster that work in FCV is not the large nor the small, micro, nano. And what to do to make this engine generation of job to continue to work under FCV context. That's what the two or three things I think is very important.
Great, thank you. So that's an MSME strategy that we need here at the bank. Thank you. Alexander, can I come to you? Melinda earlier spoke about the importance of partnerships, and that in the world of sort of greater challenges, reduced aid, institutions can no longer sort of compete for ever dwindling sources of money. But also, we've talked about partnerships for many, many years, as long as I've been doing this job. So what really does need to change? And I'd be particularly interested in what needs to change in the relationship between the UN and the World Bank, particularly in FCV settings where these partnerships are really important?
Yeah, great question indeed. Partnerships, we've been talking about it for a long time, and they have actually been quite successful in the past. But a moment like this, where we see that at least the public financing is being reduced, it forces all of us to focus really on what is the core that we bring. And in broad terms, I mean, what the World Bank and other IFIs bring is obviously the capital, the macroeconomic advice, and the macroeconomic reforms. What UN organizations and other development organizations bring is local presence and longevity of presence. I mean, the UNDP is active with development work in 130 countries and territories. Very often in fragility context, we were there, we are there, and we will be there. And that I would call political intimacy is a crucial one, because development done well these days is only when you have local political leadership, and preferably, I would even say, local political skin in the game, local political capital, but probably blessed also some financing, combined with IFI financing and combined with assistance and reform expertise that organizations such as UNDP can bring. Maybe related to one of the elements that has been brought forward here by many of you is on job creation. We agree 100%. I mean, job creation is the key to development, and it is what makes economic progress very tangible for your everyday public. But it's job creation, but I would add it's also an income. I mean, there is no lack of people working in the world these days. You would say that even in the most fragile circumstances, there is millions of people working. But many of those people working work for an income that is not creating any economic progress. I mean, a job creates economic progress if it has a certain surplus. If you have a surplus, you can save. If you can save, you have access to financial institutions. If you have so, you can borrow. And if you borrow, then you really have access to the whole economic mechanism that we know and that we aspire to. Now, translating job creation to that type of income can only work if you have productivity. And improvement of productivity means applying technology. We are a big believer that technology really is an incredible accelerator of development, and especially AI. I mean, I know that there is some skepticism sometimes on AI. From our perspective, AI is an incredible accelerator and helps to leapfrog many of the obstacles that you often would have in fragile circumstances, where sometimes access to knowledge, access to skills, capacity building are difficult to bridge gaps. From our perspective, AI actually is a great way of achieving that. That only works if you have very, very close collaboration between different types of actors. And from our perspective, a closer collaboration between IFIs, development organizations such as the UN, and local private sector and local political leadership is the key to success.
Thank you, Alexander. Melinda, let me wrap this up with you, this kind of session. Obviously, the UK is a major shareholder of institutions like the bank. We've heard a lot now. It needs to focus more on jobs. It needs to be faster. It needs to be more predictable. So as you invest in and look to invest ever dwindling amounts of ODA, as you said, what are your expectations of institutions like the World Bank?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And I'll be brief because I know we're at time. Well, the first thing to say is it's really important for countries like the UK to back multilateralism going forward. Clearly, I think the risk at this point in particular with geopolitics is that we retreat to national organizations and bilateral approaches. But it's only with multilateralism that you get the leverage at scale, you get collective action, you can sit down and talk together about shared responsibility, and you construct organizations that can deal with global challenges. So that's the very first thing. The second thing is, I think we've heard very loud and clear from everybody on the panel, when it comes to the bank, speed, agility, nimbleness, making sure that whether it is finance or its expertise and advice, the analytical products, that is done more quickly, more responsively, coming in behind country plans, ready and prepared during crises, before crises, and helping partner governments access the tools that are available to them. Thirdly, I think this whole focus on fragility isn't something which is an interesting add-on. It needs to sit at the fulcrum of what the bank's strategy is going forward, the MDB strategy more broadly, and certainly the UN. I feel a little bit that we silo too much the themes. You have climate there, you have fragility there, you have humanitarian there. And the reality is that isn't how it happens to countries. All these issues overlay and overlap. And so the bank, as in effect, putting fragility at its core, working in partnership with others is absolutely critical. And then the last thing is, I mean, we've talked about job creation and we've talked about the importance of capital to invest. I mean, of course, we've known this for such a long time. The needs are becoming ever more acute. We need to think harder, clearer, faster about how we support countries in job creation, in income, in support to vulnerable populations, for whatever reason, investing in human capital so that populations are ready and prepared to enter the job market. But we also know that it's not easy. These gains are hard won. In vulnerability, employment is difficult. People tend to go into the informal sector and make an income in whatever way they can. So it's a focus on jobs and income, but it's also a focus on decent work. And there, I think, back to this point about capital mobilization, I mean, it's really important that the bank, the MDBs join up across all their instruments, innovate, think hard about ways in which we can pull capital at scale from institutional investors into economies that really need them and where there are opportunities. But we're not going to do that on a BAU approach, on a business as usual approach. We as the donors or as the shareholders and board members need to be pushing the banks to innovate further, faster, develop their tools, make better use of them. And it's really urgent. And I think it's a topic that the time has well come. And so that's what we need to do next.
Great. Thank you, Melinda. We are sort of at time, but FCV is a tough subject. We've covered quite a lot of tough stuff. It's quite hard to be optimistic sometimes. So I'm going to challenge all of our panelists for like 10 seconds, if you can. Give us all a reason to be optimistic on this agenda in the years ahead. And let me start with our remote participants. Mr. Vice President, why should we be optimistic?
Well, in international development discourse is a room for optimism because the shift is demonstrated in the nature of the discourse itself. Now there's a growing realization that domestic revenue and international development aid is not enough. So we have to bring in private capital as an engine to drive growth and, more importantly, to create jobs. That in itself is an optimism for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Alexander?
Two things. First of all, access to capital. There is more private investable capital available than ever. And second, access to technology. The barriers to entry to using technology at a large scale have never been lower than that. Combining those two well, I think, is an incredible avenue for reducing poverty and creating more prosperity in the world.
Great, thank you. Ndiame?
Well, three things, but I'm going to go through them very quickly. The first one is that there is hard evidence that escaping conflict and poverty is possible. I worked many years in East Asia and Pacific. In 1960, a country like South Korea was just out of conflict with a per capita GDP that is much lower than DRC today. But today, that country is 60 times higher than DRC in terms of GDP per capita, and it's a real success story. Second is the youth. When I travel throughout Africa, I see the young people embracing AI, innovating. All they need is the ecosystem and the support to really transform their talent into growth. And the third one is demographic. Finally, and actually the demographics would only be a problem if public policy is unable to transform it into a benefit. But I would say that finally Africa has reached a level of density and population growth and urbanization that is really transforming the demand side of the economy. The demand of everything is increasing in Africa, and that creates investment opportunity. All we need is to create the right environment for a tidal wave of investment in the public sector for public goods, in the private sector, but also for foreign direct investment. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to come back down this way. So Mr. Sidibe.
From every crisis, from every change, you have opportunity to open new doors. The shift happening today have some adverse effect, it's true, but it gives opportunity to bring back the private sector at large and the private sector seen as a cluster in the context of FCV, to be at the center of the conversation, to be at the center of the coalition, and even to be a solution for the shrinking of the international aid or what we're seeing happening today. That's my optimism. Yeah.
Thank you. Melinda?
I mean, I agree with all of that. I would add, I think, although difficult, the decline in aid is an opportunity for countries to ask for something different, namely partnership, capital, expertise, and a focus on mutual resilience, unless this concept of fiscal transfer. I think that's now over, that's outdated, and the sooner we can embrace that, the better.
Thank you, Melinda. And Minister Said.
One word of optimism, it's our youth. It's our children who want to come back to their countries, and all we have to do is to provide the stability, the security, and they'll come back, they'll invest, and we'll be able to really have prosperity in our countries. But absolutely focus on the youth, the women, and I think we can probably have a better world.
Great. Look, thank you so much. And a round of applause to our panelists, please. Look, thank you all. That's the end of this session, and apologies for being slightly late, but thanks again.
Thank you.
Also,